you. The need to know news of the day. But seriously, we appreciate you stepping into that leadership role. And I think taking such a collaborative approach, a Team Ottawa approach, as you indicated, and at a time when there is a lot of uncertainty, I'm sure we're all feeling that way, especially given the week's events. Hearing a list of things where we're moving forward gives us a lot of assurance, and if we're making progress at home, maybe we can make progress on a provincial and national level. So thank you once again, a big round of applause for Mayor Mark Sutcliffe. I'm sure our event planner would ask me to once again say, please eat your salads, not only to remain healthy and get some vegetables, but also that'll help us serve our next course. The next thing on our agenda is a presentation from our chief economist. I'll take a second to introduce her. Her name is Duangsuda Sopchachai. Duangsuda is the director of PwC's Economics and Policy Practice in Ottawa, where she leads a multidisciplinary teams delivering rigorous economic analysis and practical policy advice to government, industry associations, and private sector clients. Prior to PwC, Duangsuda had a progressive roles, combined applied research with external engagement, including the Associate Director of Economic Research at the Conference Board of Canada, and as a researcher within Canada's federal and Crown landscape. Her academic background includes a PhD in economics from the University of Ottawa, complemented by a foundation in business management. I like that you're eating your salads. Keep continuing. She currently serves on the board of Ottawa Economic Association, contributing to the capital's economic policy dialogue and professional committee. Please give her a warm Ottawa welcome to Duangsuda. Here she is.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for such a warm introduction and welcome. That sounds so good that I didn't even recognize it was me he was talking about, but thank you. Maybe let me start by framing the global economic environment we're operating in for 2026, because I believe the forces that shaping the world around us today is really important for us in understanding Canada's economic outlook. So against this backdrop, there are really 6 global forces that stand out, especially important for understanding the year ahead of us. First, global growth is slowing, and a big part of that is the shift towards a more fragmented trading environment that we've been seeing. The tariff shock we saw last year is now fully working its way through the global supply chains, and the uncertainty around future trade rules is making firms very much more cautious about the decisions around hiring, how they're investing, or committing to any of the cross-border activities. The second thing is that tariffs have become the single biggest disruptor of the global economy. The new US tariff regime, as we've seen, has really pushed up the effective tariff rates at the highest level in modern decades. And while some parts of the package of the tariffs are already being challenged in the court, meaning that some of the very specific tariff clauses and lines could be blocked, it could be delayed and changed, etc. But what we think is that the broader expectation is the US will continue to rely very heavily on targeted sector-specific tariffs as a strategic tool in negotiations with all the countries. And for countries like Canada, we're deeply embedded in the US supply chain, we're export dependent. This really creates a much more unpredictable backdrop for Canada in the coming years. Thirdly, we're seeing a payback effect in the global goods trade. Last year alone, we saw many firms rush to bring goods in early. This is what we call that front-loading activities, to get ahead of the tariffs that were increasing month by month last year. And that really created the artificial spike in the data in 2025, so that this year, what we're going to be seeing is the reversal of that, a slower trade volumes as inventories get sort of worked down. And this is really going to show up most sharply in Asia and in other global integrated manufacturing sectors. Next, there is actually a bright spot in all of this, and we've been seeing that boom in AI investment globally. So for this year, we do expect to continue to see that strong capital flowing in things like data centers, chips manufacturing, digital infrastructure, and the like, which is going to really help offset some of the weaknesses in other investment categories around the world. And we do expect to see the pace of that AI investment will come in sort of more like a waves throughout the year rather than in a straight line or more traditional ways you've seen investment unfold. Fifth thing is that, I guess another good news is inflation globally is easing in major economies. The supply chain has mostly normalized. Weaker demand is taking some of the heat out of prices we see globally. The tariff-heavy markets, though, like the United States, inflation is proving to be a bit stickier, which of course makes the central banks more cautious about cutting rates too fast. And that is, of course, being United States, very big. The caution does flow through into these global financial conditions that we're seeing. And last but not least, the climate volatility remains very much a structural source of uncertainty for global companies. With extreme weather events becoming very more frequent, it have very real economic effects on things like food prices, agricultural yields, energy systems, and even insurance costs. And these shocks don't show up every quarter per se, in the announcement and whatnot, but they are now very much a persisting background risk that policymakers and businesses alike increasingly have to plan around. So all of these macro dynamics, things like the tariff shocks I mentioned, fragmentation of trade, they don't occur in vacuum, and they're a symptom of worlds where geopolitical tensions are rising. And if you've seen in the news every day, these old assumptions about stability no longer hold. So with that, we're going to shift a little bit from the economic backdrop to geopolitics. And the key theme for 2026 is that we're operating in a world where traditional guardrails that kept the global relations predictable are weakening. And our experts describe a clear move toward a more fragmented, more contested global order, especially going forward in this year. And major power rivalry, especially between United States and China, now sit at the center of almost every strategic and economic decision being made globally. The underlying disputes like technology access, critical minerals, export control, especially the situation of Taiwan, this remain very much a key risk, in fact, that could escalate in 2026. In parallel, we saw Russia continues to pressure NATO through this called the gray zone tactics. So things like airspace incursions, cyber attacks, any sabotage attempts that sort of stop short of being an open conflict. But what they do is that they raise this probability of miscalculation, especially along the NATO's eastern flank. Across the Middle East, we see temporary pauses in conflict that actually have not really fundamentally reduced tensions. Iran's ambition, another thing in proxy networks, continue to pose that risk that can spill over in global energy markets, security arrangement as well. And what really ties all of this together is the strain on traditional alliances where the US is now taking more of a transactional approach to its security commitments. For instance, we could see more of the security guarantees being increasingly linked to things like trade, which I think we're already seeing that, technology restrictions, or even the defense contracts. And so even this idea of the US not fully backing its NATO defense promises, making claims over places like Greenland, this would be very much more than enough to undermine sort of that foundation of the alliance that we know today. At the same time of all this, we're seeing also the rise of what we call influential middle powers, like India, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, alongside a more active regional trading blocs like CPTPP, the BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organizations. And these groups don't really replace sort of the old system that we have, but they do reflect a world where power and influence are no longer dominated by a few major powers, to one where influence is distributed across more countries and more regional blocs. And what it does is that it makes global coordination much harder, more complex, and also slower. Alongside these geopolitical shifts, we're also dealing with systemic risk, which add another layer to that uncertainty in the global market. So things like cyber attacks on critical infrastructure are becoming more frequent, and the risk of escalation in major power flashpoints, whether it's Russia, NATO, US, China, this continues to hang over the global markets in our data. And none of these three outcomes are certain per se, but it is one of the risks, and together, these really widen the range of the risks that the global economy has to absorb. So overall, the geopolitics of 2026 isn't really about one single crisis. It's about several pressures overlapping at the same time. And together they create a more fragmented, less predictable world. And that uncertainty directly shapes the economic and policy environment Canada has to now navigate. So now turning to Canada, and what we're expecting for 2026 is another year of slow growth, unfortunately. Real GDP is expected to expand by just about 1.2%, which is, yes, positive, but significantly below the pace we saw coming out of the pandemic. We expect the growth to tick up a little bit more in 2027, maybe to 1.5%, but overall we're in a softer growth environment. And this is really driven by a lot of these global factors I've just mentioned, but also other domestic factors that we're going to discuss in a little bit. On the household side, demands remain quite soft and real income gains are modest. And even though we're seeing interest rates coming down, many Canadians are actually still adjusting to a much higher borrowing cost than they were used to just a few years ago. We also have not fully recovered from the disruption we experienced last year, whether from the trade uncertainty, we have shifting immigration flows, sector-specific shocks that really affected the employment level as well as prices. So as a result, the consumption growth is likely to hover in that 1.1, 1.2% this year, which is again quite well below historical averages of about 3 to 4% per year. Business investment also tell a very similar story. Firms continue to delay their major spending decisions because of uncertainty around this year's CUSMA review, for instance, and ongoing volatility in the US tariff environment. And our data shows that capital spending in machinery and equipment and non-residential structures in Canada has been subdued for several quarters last year. And that cautious approach is likely to persist, especially in trade-exposed sectors like auto, metals, wood products, and machinery manufacturing. And one of the most important structural changes shaping Canada's outlook that I sort of alluded to already is that sharp slowdown in population growth, which, tighter immigration caps that we have, restrictions on temporary residents. So overall population growth is going to slow considerably from the record highs of the recent years that we've seen. And this, of course, has meaningful implications like lower labor force growth, softer demand for housing, slower household formation, and cooler pace in spending on goods and services as well. On the trade side, we do think that export provides some support this year for Canada's economic outlook, although that is still very much dependent on the stability of Canada-US trade relationship. So we're expecting the growth to be quite modest in that 0.5 to 0.8% range this year. And that really comes down to, again, the tariff, economic momentum in the United States, and the health of global goods demand. Now, even though the near-term picture is one of softer demand, there are some emerging tailwinds. And I think in this room we're hearing this conversation again and again. The new federal government is leaning quite heavily into this long-term investment, things like infrastructure, critical minerals, clean tech, and defense. And starting all these sort of conversation and initiatives are really starting to lift the confidence in sectors tied to energy, sectors tied to innovation, as well as advanced manufacturing. We're also seeing early signs of trade diversification, with more exports from Canada now going to markets like Japan and Vietnam, and new partnership forming in critical minerals and energy with countries like Germany, South Korea, and Japan as well. And these shifts are, early days and won't fully offset the drags from tariffs and slower population growth we're seeing this year, but they do help set the stage for a more resilient investment environment as we move into 2027 and beyond. And when we look at the labor market and inflation backdrop for Canada, we see an economy that's moving through a very gradual cooling phase. Employment growth, for example, has slowed noticeably, but this is because population growth is also slowing. The unemployment rate is expected now to drift down to maybe from last year, I think 6.8% was towards the end of the year, to maybe roughly 6.3% by the end of this year. But it is really important to highlight that this is not really a demand-driven tightening per se. It's simply fewer new workers are entering the labor force. Wage pressures have definitely eased significantly as well, and we're starting to see that wage growth now is back to that 3 to 4% range level as compared to that 5 to 6% level we saw during the tightest part of post-pandemic labor market. And that slowdown is important because it really helped taking the heat out of the system, and it's a big part of why we're seeing the inflation's finally coming down in the data. So for inflation, as mentioned broadly, it's moving in the right direction. We're expecting the Bank of Canada is going to, the inflation to get back to the Bank of Canada's 2% target by the middle of this year. But the overall inflation might be sitting just a touch higher than that, mainly because food prices are still rising quite fast, especially than most other categories. And so given this backdrop, we think the Bank of Canada has very little incentive to move in either direction, and that the policy rate is likely to stay at that 2.25% throughout all of this year. And turning to housing in Canada, being 20% of Canada's economy, it remains quite central to Canada's macro outlook. And after quite a weak performance last year, we're now starting to see some of that stabilization coming in. And what I mean by that is that we're starting to see national resale activities remaining subdued, but that the listing have also pulled back, so that the sales to new listing ratio has improved enough to suggest that prices potentially, which last year was slightly negative, should begin to rise again modestly this year in a low single digits gains as we move through 2026. Purpose-built rental constructions in Canada continues to be a bright spot. Start in this category actually remain elevated and should stay nearly that 250,000 annualized level. But in all of this, of course, there's also that counterbalance where the number of newly completed but unsold condos unit have actually climbed to near record highs in some markets, especially in places like British Columbia. And this inventory buildup will likely make developers more cautious about launching new projects in the near to medium term. And business investment is also under pressure, so we don't expect non-residential structures and machinery equipment spending to accelerate until firms gain a bit more clarity on the trade environment we just talked about. So investment growth in 2026 really is expected to be that 0 to 1% range, which is again very subdued by historical standards of about 3 to 5%. And across all the sectors in Canada, the picture is quite uneven, so I'm just going to highlight a few here. Manufacturing is going to continue to feel most of the weight of U.S. tariffs, especially in autos, in metals, machinery, where uncertainty remains quite high. On the other hand, though, energy production in Canada is quite stable. The revenues are softer right now, mostly because global oil prices are well below last year's peaks. And on the services side, growth is modest, very dependent on what's going to happen in the United States economy, particularly for professional services, tech, and tourism. And now for Ottawa, so when we look at the City of Ottawa's outlook for 2026, we actually see a very similar story of the local economy that reflects sort of that national patterns, but with a very few Ottawa sort of specific twists, if you will. Generally speaking, we see very stable but subdued growth this year, which is probably not a surprise to a lot of people. We expect the real GDP growth for Ottawa-Gatineau region to be just under 0.5%, which is weaker than 0.8% last year and 1.2% in the year before that. And the single most important driver for Ottawa is the federal government. And with federal governments operating under a very tight budget, restraining hiring, workforce adjustment, et cetera, the pace of job creation in the public sector remains quite modest. And that has a direct impact on this local spending that we're seeing, the housing demand, and the broader services ecosystem that also supports the federal government. And just like anywhere else in Canada, population growth in Ottawa is also slowing as immigration levels are reduced. Ottawa will still grow population-wise, but at a much slower rate than we have seen over the past few years. And in a way that eases some pressure on the labor market, on rental demand, housing demand, etc. But it also means fewer tailwinds for households, spending, and construction. And our tech sector, which is a long pillar of Ottawa's private sector employment, is stabilizing after 2 years, a couple of years of volatility we've seen. The firms are now hiring selectively with growth concentrated in cybersecurity, AI-adjacent services, and defense-related technologies. And this is really an upside to all these things. It's supported by rising demand in defense-related R&D, the cybersecurity and innovation as defense spending, federal defense spending increases. And though this is very good news, we're actually not expecting sort of that broad-based acceleration across the entire tech sector this year, but maybe more so in the next 5 years. Tourism and hospitality in Ottawa, I think is actually already sort of mentioned. One of the few bright spots in Ottawa's outlook for 2026 for sure. After seeing several softer years for the tourism sector, the sector is finally seeing a more meaningful pickup, especially especially with a weaker Canadian dollar, which going to help attract more US and international visitors to come here. I think the mayor already mentioned a little bit that the city also really going to benefit from a pretty strong lineup of major events that are going to happen this year in Ottawa, like Ironman. I think there's track and field championships. And of course, we also have the new attraction like the Hard Rock Hotel and Casino. Housing does remain a real pressure point in the region. And again, this is both Ottawa and Gatineau as a region together. With the population growth slowing, buyers may be feeling a bit less confident because of the federal workforce adjustment. We do expect to see the continuation of the demand cooling in the region. That said, rental affordability is still quite tough, especially we're seeing vacancy rates being relatively low, while rents continuing to rise still. And I acknowledge the federal government is investing $400 million in housing project in Ottawa, but I don't think that's going to necessarily show up in the data for this year, just because the projects are likely going to still be in the pre-construction phase, so the impact is going to be more likely appearing starting in 2027. That said, non-residential construction is actually a major bright spot as well for Ottawa. Output right now is expected to rise to 3 to 5% annually over the next several years. And this is driven largely by a few major projects that we're having here, like the Ottawa Hospital, the library, we have the LRT, and of course the Lansdowne redevelopment as well. So all in all, I think Ottawa enters 2026 in a position of stability, but not broad-based momentum. And most traditional drivers that we've seen, like population growth, public sector hiring, those are cooling. At the same time, Ottawa's defense, cybersecurity, national security aligned tech sectors, and large infrastructure projects are emerging as real pockets of strength for our region. Thank you very much for that. And I'm going to pass the mic back to
My name is Neil Schwartz. I'm a partner at Mann Lawyers. We've been a proud presenting sponsor of this event for many years, and it's always great to reconnect with the business community in Ottawa after the holiday break and understand more about the economic outlook. It seems like every year there are different headwinds, there are different tailwinds. I'm ever an optimist, so I'm encouraged that this community together can find solutions to the problems that we're facing. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing Honorable Jenna Sudds, and I'll do that in just a moment. But just a housekeeping note, some of you, I'm told, would have passed the merch stop, the merch store on the way in. So you can pick up your T-shirts, your Nobel Prizes, and your Olympic medals on your way out. So make sure you check that out on the way out. The Honourable Jenna Sudds is the Member of Parliament for Canada and Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Government Transformation, Public Works and Procurement, and to the Secretary of State for Defence Procurement. She previously served as Minister of Families, Children and Social Development. She serves as the Chair of the Liberal Technology Caucus. Before entering federal politics, Jenna was City Councillor for Canada North and Deputy Mayor of Ottawa. She's also spent over a decade in Ottawa's technology sector and started her career as an economist in the public service. Jenna is a strong advocate for innovation, economic growth, and Canada's leadership in the tech sector. And as the mom to three teenage daughters, I'm the father of 3 teenage sons, so hopefully we never cross paths in a precarious setting. But with that, I'd like to welcome Jenna to the stage.
Thank you. I said the short bio would work, but next time we'll remember. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to join you here this afternoon. My sincere thanks, as always, to Sue Lang, the team at OBOT, as well as Michael and the team at OBJ for giving us a reason to come together and to be able to focus on issues that are so relevant here in our city and our economy. Great to be joined by a number of my colleagues, the Honourable Mona Fortier, Mary-France Lalonde, and Yazir Naqvi. We have an incredible Ottawa caucus, 13 MPs who are working hard day in and day out on behalf of all corners of our amazing city and across, of course, to the Gatineau side as well. So we are truly at a defining moment here for Canada's security, economy, and sovereignty. And as our Prime Minister said just yesterday at the World Economic Forum, we are in the midst of a rupture, not a transition. A shift that demands that we strengthen Canada's sovereign, industrial, and defense capacity. From growing geopolitical instability to renewed competition in the Arctic, the world is becoming more contested, more technologically driven, and less forgiving of dependence. Defense today is not only about equipment. It's about resilience, it's about trusted supply chains, and the ability to act alongside our allies when it matters most. And nowhere in Canada is better positioned to meet this moment than Ottawa, our city. Ottawa is not simply, of course, the seat of government. It's a national and allied defense hub. Here, policy and procurement decisions are made alongside incredible AI companies, expertise in cybersecurity, autonomous technologies, advanced manufacturing, and secure communications. This region truly brings together the Canadian Armed Forces, NATO-linked decision makers, diplomats, investors, and business leaders across the city and across the ecosystem. There are few places in the world that combine government, industry, and allied engagement this tightly as we do here in this city. And in an era where speed, trust, and interoperability matter, that concentration gives us a strategic advantage. Since last spring, our new government has taken deliberate steps to align defense investment and economic sovereignty. The new Buy Canadian policy ensures that strategic defense procurement prioritizes companies with real Canadian presence, with real R&D here in this country, real manufacturing, and real jobs here at home. This is not about closing doors. It's actually about ensuring that Canada meets and exceeds our NATO commitments, that we protect our Arctic sovereignty, and that we contribute meaningfully to allied operations without over-reliance on fragile global supply chains. To meet today's threats, Canada also needs to change how we work here at home with industry. That's why we've created the Defence Investment Agency to be able to move faster, engage earlier with industry, and focus on mission-ready capabilities. The first Defence Investment Agency announcement with Telesat and MDA, who I know we'll hear from shortly, is working to secure Canada's space-based communications. These capabilities are essential for Arctic operations, NORAD modernization, NATO interoperability, and command and control in contested environments. This procurement demonstrates a new approach, partnering with Canadian firms to deliver sovereign capability that supports both national defense and allied security. Innovation must also scale. That's why FedDev Ontario has launched the Regional Defence Investment Initiative, which here means almost $200 million of investment to help defence and dual-use technology companies expand production, modernize their facilities, and integrate into Canadian and allied supply chains. So let me close with this. Canada's sovereignty, particularly in the Arctic, will be shaped by what we can build, deploy, and sustain ourselves alongside our NATO allies. Ottawa and all of us here in this room are at the center of that effort. The policy direction is clear, the investment is real, and the demand is growing. So now is the moment for Ottawa's defense and dual-use companies to step forward in a way they never have, to step forward to lead and to deliver. And I believe if we can rise to this occasion, Ottawa will not only support Canada's defense, but will help define Canada's role on the world stage. Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup.
Thank you, Jenna, for your remarks and for that important information about the opportunity for Ottawa. And if I could say to Mona, who is the co-chair of the NCR caucus, and all of our colleagues, we are in a time of great opportunity for partnership, and we really appreciate the leadership that you've shown in engaging with all the economic partners so that we're all aligned in our objectives. So we appreciate it very much. Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce Kevin Reid, our next speaker. He is the president and COO of the Defense Resilience and Security Bank Development Group. Kevin has over 25 years' experience as a leader in C-suite roles. He's been involved in more than 30 acquisitions and has extensive experience related to the turnaround and startup of numerous private and public companies. Kevin co-founded a Canadian financial institution for which he served as the vice chairman, CEO, and president, and led transactions in excess of over $12 billion. He was appointed as an honorary colonel in the Canadian Armed Forces from 2008 to 2017, and he also served as the honorary Counselor General for the Republic of Singapore to Canada. Please welcome to our stage, Kevin Reid. Are we on? Now, one thing that wasn't in that is you have Ottawa roots.
Well, let me start by saying thank you
Yes.
for the invitation to come back to Ottawa.
Thank you.
Ottawa has been a big part of my life, certainly over 10 years of it, for which I went to the University of Ottawa. I built my first company here. I think my business partner, Paul Butler, is somewhere out there, I think. But Ottawa is near and dear to my heart. It's quality life. I had a tremendous time here, and I always love an invitation back because it's just a great city. So,
Well, do you want to move back? We'd love to have you. We'd love to have you. We'll leave that for later.
yeah, we'll be back. And, you know, I know you've got some questions for me, but
Yes.
before...
Actual question.
Yeah, before we get into the questions, I would like to highlight some things. Think about where Canada was a year ago. And I can tell you, because I've had the privilege of traveling to many countries and to NATO and whatnot, in the last 7, 8 months, Canada started to matter again out there. And it's a pretty good feeling. There's a small term that's starting to grow, but it's called the Canadianization of NATO. And I started to hear that a couple months ago, and I went, that's interesting. That's pretty cool, actually. But and so great leadership, I think we saw it from our Prime Minister's speech yesterday, has emerged. And when that happens, it's great just to see Canada back on the map. And we're just getting started. So I'll turn it back to you because I love Ottawa. I love Canada, and it's great to go around the world and know that we start to matter again.
I appreciate you saying that. And I was saying that earlier, like we have this event every year, and it was a very different feeling in the room at this time last year. Not that there's not a lot of work ahead of us, but I think we have a clearer vision of what that is that we can do together. And you being a part of it, we're very grateful for. So.
And do I come to you to get a house, or how?
Yeah, I'll help. We'll help. We'll figure it
Okay,
out.
all right. Okay, thank you.
Yes, Wendy's got it.
Thank
Okay,
you.
we got it. Okay, so for those who may be new to the DSRB, and I've been saying DSRB to try and get that right.
Sure.
Can you start by explaining what the Defense, Security and Resilience Bank is, and maybe more importantly, what it is not? And how did this idea for a diplomatic multilateral defense financial institution come to be?
Well, let's start with how it became, or came to fruition. The founder, Rob Murray, is of the blueprint for the Defense, Security, Resilience Bank. Worked at NATO. He's a Brit, Army officer, as a former Canadian honorary colonel. I like to give him some, shots. But he then went to NATO and worked for the Secretary General, leading innovation at NATO for 10 years. And he wrote 3 blueprints because he saw this need in the market. The first was for the NATO Innovation Fund. That did get stood up, and in fact, Canada didn't participate in the first go, but it did come in the budget, and so Canada will become a limited partner at some point this year into the NATO Innovation Fund, and I think they raised on the first go around about €1 billion. He also wrote a blueprint for the for the Diana program, which is the Deep Tech Accelerator program that Canada has 14 test centers, I think, but we have a headquarters in Halifax for North American headquarters for that. So that was his second blueprint. And the third one was this bank. And so these were all written about 4 or 5 years ago. 2 years ago, the world was very different for a bank. It wouldn't have worked. And 2 years from now, the bank would be too late because we've seen the pace of change in the geopolitical realm. We've seen threats emerge. We've seen new types of threats, just not kinetic, emerge. And so the timing for this blueprint for the bank is now. And so I was brought in as the president 1 year ago, January of 2025. And from that time, we had a few key gates. We knew that the NATO meeting at the end of June was coming up, a lot of pressure for 5%. That would be a big catalyst for us, we believed, if it was passed, because that's taking NATO's spend 1.4 trillion to 4 trillion, not including what the president said 2 weeks ago of taking their spending from 900 billion to 1.5 trillion. These are tectonic steps up of investment into defense. And so that happened. We could start to see the movement within nations. We signed up 7 global banks. Royal Bank of Canada was the first bank on, and obviously a great Canadian bank. We have JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, LBBW, Commerce Bank, and ING. We will be bringing on some other banks here imminently. And that occurred in August. And then we had a session in the City of London at Mansion House. We gave 4 weeks' notice. We sent invitations to 41 world leaders saying, could you please send a Minister of Defense, Minister of Finance, or a Senior Ambassador for a briefing on the bank, how it would work, what the products would be. 4 weeks, 8 September, we had 175 delegates, 37 countries showed up, 4 central bankers, and Canada had the largest delegation, which I was really happy to see. And so the next gates through for this bank are to organize founding nations, and I think it's well known out in the world that Canada is one of those founding nations, first G7, to start to go into charter negotiations, and that'll be a real critical next milestone here in the ensuing weeks. And so this bank, when stood up, would have 40 nations plus shareholders, owned by nations, just like a World Bank, but this would be the only multilateral bank designed for pure defense and security and resiliency. The capitalization would be about $100 billion from member nations, AAA rated, that we would go over time to the bond market and raise another $500 to $600 billion. Well, that would then work towards flowing back into those member countries to help with their defense and security. So that's a really quick overview of a little bit of the timeline, but this has moved in the sands of politics to do what we've done in the last year is only telling of the sense of urgency that countries need and companies need, especially in the supply chain.
I think you might have alluded to it, but why is now the critical time for this to happen?
Well, if you put it in Canadian context, we're going to go from you can take your benchmarking, but $30 billion of defense spending to $150 billion by 2034, 2035, and so wonderful, great. Those funds every year are going to flow down into prime contractors, who then have their supply chains, their SMEs, their supply chains. 99% of them are private companies in the defense supply chain. They're having discussions with their primes saying, okay, the order book in 2 years, 3 years, we need you to grow 25%. And those companies that are private are saying, I'm calling up my bank manager saying, okay, I need 25 million for an expansion on my plant to meet the orders from the primes. And if anyone has been working in the defense category the last 20 years, you know how hard it is to get credit. You know, if you're lucky, you might have a bank account. I've known lots of companies that when they hit a threshold of revenue in defense, they get debanked. So 2025 was a turning point in Europe, UK, US, and Canada for rewriting ESG rules to allow defense to become bankable. They tucked it in under societal, that defense, I mean, thinking back, it seems preposterous, but defense is protecting of society, so they've got that done. And so now you're seeing the commercial banks right across all of our allied nations start to ramp up banking teams. You're seeing the institutional money start to prepare to come into it from pension funds. There's going to be a little bit of a laggard there, but you're seeing the motions coming in. But that money coming down from the governments to spend, if we can't grow our industrial base, and the only way we'll grow that industrial base is through our commercial banks, venture capital, and PE, we're going to have defense inflation. And if you want to order a shoulder-fired rocket launcher today, which may be a standard piece of kit parts of the world, it's a 7-year wait list. How do you get that down so it's a 3-month wait list? Well, you need more industrial capacity. And so this money's going to pour in. We are going to put money into the banking system from the DSRB through credit guarantees to unlock, which Canada will probably require, to get to that number, 65 to 85 billion of new credit into that SME supply chain.
That's super cool. Thank you. The DSRB has been described as modeled on institutions like the World Bank. Can you walk us through, you know, how it will work financially and diplomatically so that it complements rather than replaces? And I think you kind of alluded to that. It's not to replace, but to complement our current systems.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, our approach to this, let me just start with the nature of a multilateral bank is owned by member nations. Just like the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, the Asian Development Bank, exact same model, except for this is meant specifically for defense, security, and resilience. The EIB today is a large institution of Luxembourg. They can't do hard defense. They can build bases, but in their constitution, they can't buy planes, they can't build bullets, or buy bullets, they can't touch it. So, owned by member nations, a balance sheet over 4 or 5 years of $500-600 billion. What would that mean for Canada? If Canada decides to become a shareholder nation, and I'm going to give numbers that have not been endorsed by the government of Canada, this is a hypothetical, but if Canada wished to invest $10 billion, and the way that works is $2 billion is a check written in, and there's a callable feature that is very common with all multilaterals. You can pay that $2 billion over 3 or 4 years. But Canada would get credit for $10 billion of equity because it's a callable, if needed, it would be called upon. That would allow then leverage of another 5 to 6 times. That's 50 to 60 billion. And if you take that 50 to 60 billion and put it into credit guarantees over our commercial banks, that takes their lending capacity. Risk-weighted capital calculations are arcane, but if a bank today has $1 of equity and lends 11 into fixed assets and working capital on average, putting a credit guarantee of a AAA on it, they can take that $1, not lend 11, lend $25, $35. And so the credit expansion is fast, it's real, and that's where we got to get the money flowing into the SMEs who all are private, most of them are private companies. Their only relationships for access to capital is the banks, and it's been really hard, but that's changing. So our goal is to get capital deep into the system so that credit expansion, industrial expansion can happen.
Thank you. I followed most of that. Most of that I got. Okay, so I know that you have confidential details you can't share, but can you say for us, where do things stand globally today? So how are countries engaging? What are the next phases of building the institution? And what can we, as a public, expect to hear?
Yeah, so I think I opened by saying it's great to be back as Canada. It really is. And so the cards at the table today, and they can always change. I think we're seeing them change on an hourly basis sometimes. And no surprise here. There's a lot of tension between Europe and the U.S. going back to the Munich Security Conference last year. And they don't want it in the U.S. The U.S. is 55-60% of NATO spend, industrial base, but they don't want this bank in the U.S., and the U.S. is okay with that. Pacific Rim doesn't want it in Brussels or The Hague. And so what's happened is, while we started this process, we've elected a leader who understands multilateral banks. In fact, he made a reference to it in his Q&A yesterday. And Canada is now emerged in the last 3 or 4 months as literally I call it the Switzerland of G7 banking standards. So we're not a superpower, we're the honest broker. And I think, we've got to get through some gates, but I think Canada has a really decent shot to get the bank headquarters here. And what would that mean? Anyone who's worked in defense, you know that this industry is not a traditional normal industry, unlike manufacturing cars or steel. It's loaded with sensitive information and security, and you got ITAR, and you've got the complexity is deep. And so wherever this bank lands, to build a defense finance center and the spin-offs that will occur, the bank should be at least 3,500 people. But because of that knowledge of defense, I think you'll see private equity, you'll see venture capital, you'll see defense insurance, which is a bit overlooked. You'll start to see Luxembourg has a big bond market because of the EIB. I've spoken to some of the people in Canada about we should be preparing to do defense bonds here. That would be a $3.5 trillion market in 3 or 4 years when you look at just the size. That's just defense bonds. So that whole ecosystem gets touched, and when you're inside that bubble, and the DSRB would allow that anchor to be the bubble, I think for any nation who gets that and to be servicing 40 other nations' defense needs is pretty powerful.
Very cool. You've had an opportunity to have some insight into how we are evolving our defense innovation strategy here in the National Capital Region. From your perspective, which is unique, what stands out about this sort of integrated, mission-driven approach for our defense innovation ecosystem?
I think it was probably September is when I first met, started to first connect through Glenn Cowan, who's, by the way, a great Ottawa company. This guy's a leader in venture capital. He's nailing it. And I spoke to Blake Goldring yesterday. He said this, hi. Very happy. But this guy's a great leader. He introduced me to Sonia. And talking to Sonia, she said, I'm about to launch this defense strategy. So, do you mind if I had a copy? So I read it. I went, holy smokes. I sent to a couple other people we have in Europe. And I said, what do you guys think? They said, this is at a level that they haven't seen nations put together. Thoughtful, how you execute against it. And I think it was in pillar 8 of 10 pillars. She was kind enough to say, which I didn't know, aside from having 1.9 here, the DSRB should be here. Mm-hmm. And I think that came out in October 25th, 28th, something like that. You made the announcement, and needless to say, it's been a good sign for Canada. And I know that Ottawa, the politicians in Ottawa are very, very happy to see the work that you did, Sonia, and your team. And so I think it was, if you haven't read it, I think I would highly encourage it because it's a great body of work.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And I agree. We're very lucky to have Sonia and Invest Ottawa leading this. Okay, last question for you. If you have one message that you want to share with Canadian founders, SMEs, and scale-ups to take away about the DSRB and the future of innovation in defense, what would it be? Just one, 3-sentence piece.
Help is coming. You know what? I can't think of any better investment cycle I've ever seen in my career. Mm-hmm. I think out of necessity, the money is going to flow. Procurement's going to get faster. It's going to get better. We did talk about opening the Defense Investment Agency run by Doug Guzman. This cycle time is going to get better. It has to get better. If you're in the sector, I think you're going to do extremely well. If you're in a startup, you're going to do very well. Unlike, this has all changed in 12 months. This has been in real time. Every week it just gets faster. What was the question again?
What's the message that you would love, the one message you'd like to share with our founders and our SMEs in this space?
Go for it.
Go for it. Okay. That's good. Thank you. Thank you. Go ahead.
I would love to come back to Ottawa for any other
Oh, we have
times
like
back.
50 events a year. You
oh,
can come back every
boy.
time.
Except for when I came out of my hotel and it was minus 25.
Oh,
And I was in Whistler 3 days ago, and I'm like, ooh.
it's hardly ever this cold here.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, hardly
I know,
ever.
I know.
So,
Figment of my
yeah.
imagination.
And we'll be in touch around getting you a house, too.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for being here, Kevin.
With focused investment, we are going to deliver disproportionate impact. We have modestly estimated, and we are updating those estimates now, a minimum of 18,000 new jobs and almost $10 billion in new GDP, with $3 billion invested into this region in a multitude of ways that will deliver new sovereign capabilities, accelerated commercialization and exports, and meaningful contributions to allied security. This is why we are pursuing bold nation-building opportunities like that bank, and we all know there is nowhere better in the entire world than right here for that bank to be headquartered. And we are pursuing it ambitiously and aggressively every single day. The leaders on the stage that will be here with us today, they're not debating theory, they're delivering, and they're showing what values-based collaboration looks like when it matters most. We're living through a period of profound geopolitical change and risk, as we know. From your vantage point, I would love to hear from each of you what makes this moment fundamentally different, and why does it demand faster, more coordinated action between government, industry, and allies? Amy, my friend, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. First of all, thank you for having me. Thrilled to be here. I have had a 4-decade career in Ottawa in the tech sector, in the defense sector. It started up on the Hill many, many decades ago. And so Ottawa's home for me, and the community, the business community, the community at large is where I raised my family, where my husband and I raised our daughter. It's a very big part of my life. And so this moment for me and for our company, MDA Space, and I would say, I hope for others, or the way that I think of it at least, is rooted in the fact that I have been the beneficiary of a wonderful quality of life, an amazing education, world-class healthcare, fabulous career that I hope is not over. I don't think it is. Because of the foundation that came out of the Second World War. It was built coming out of the Second World War, the industrial strength, all of the policies, all of the programs, all of the things that have contributed to Canada's very privileged position in the world. And that's at risk right now. That's what that moment means to me, is that foundation is gone. I believe the Prime Minister when he says that. I feel it in my gut. That foundation that I have been so grateful for and that I benefited for, and I think probably many of us in the room have, is gone. And I feel a very strong ownership and responsibility that we have to do what my parents did and their generation did, is put that foundation back in place for the next 80 years, for the next 8 generations, for whatever it takes. That's, for me, the root of what we're talking about.
I mean, listen, in some ways, some of us who've worked in the fields that we've been working in, I've been in the space sector for 30-something years. I know a little bit about Mitch and Glenn's and Amy's background. In many ways, I think a lot of us are thinking is, God, it took us too long to get to this point in time. For many, many, many years, we, and not just Canada, but most of Canada's allies, have been derelict in terms of making the investments that we've needed to make to ensure our security, ensure our sovereignty, and meet our commitments that we've made, over and over again and haven't been living up to. And for those of us in industry who have built companies with the kinds of capabilities and expertise to partner with government and to deliver on the promises that we've made, candidly, it's been very frustrating. We've done everything we could over, I'd say, some decades to try to catalyze the moment that, we now find ourselves in. Feels to me that this moment has mostly been catalyzed by things that have gone on outside of our borders. But so, in some ways, perversely, we're glad that we are where we are. We've got deep capabilities in this town. and in this country to help our government meet the ambitious goals that they've been talking about, that they've set. We're delighted to hear the things that the government is saying about what they want to do, and we're seeing some early first steps, and certainly the contract that MDA and Telesat received in partnership with the federal government is I think, a great concrete indication of that. But in any event, now, we're sort of finally here, but oh my gosh, we've got an enormous amount to do, and we're keen to get at it.
The spending that we're experiencing right now is not a job creation program. It's not an economic development. It's a mobilization for war, on a war on a scale that we have not seen. And if you have the ability to look behind the curtain and understand sort of how some of these sort of events will unfold, we're seeing it in real time, and it's being sensationalized in a very emotive way. But the seeds have been planted decades ago. And Canada's late to the party, and so if we fail to plan, then we better plan to fail. And defense is an expensive business, and we're gonna have to make the decision whether we wanna pay now or pay later, and if we pay later, it's gonna be way more expensive, and it's not just gonna be financial. And so, the moment is ripe to bring this together, because the way that we stop going to war, and I've been to war, and it's terrible, you be so bloody deterrent that no one wants to fight you. And that's how you don't go to war. And that's what the defense tech industry and companies that are building really creative, really agile, and really lethal systems, so that we become such a prickly porcupine that no one wants to interfere or sort of attack. And that's what's happening. And so that may sound alarmist. I really don't think I'm wrong. I hope I am, but there is a window where we can collectively work together to not have that happen.
We founded Dominion Dynamics 7 months ago on D-Day. We fundamentally believe that Canada requires a neo-prime, a sovereign integrator for the country. What a neo-prime is, it's all about speed, rapidly developing capabilities, iterating with the warfighter to ensure that we can compress the procurement timelines and the technology timelines that can often be decades when warfighters need capabilities in weeks and months. Why now? I think my panel mate said a number of very legitimate reasons why now makes sense. But I will call out the technology shift that has occurred in battlefields around the world. The shift in technology is happening in days in Ukraine, and we saw in Israel in that conflict. Our military is prepared for a war 1970, 1980s timeline, and we need companies like Dominion and many other companies like us to start in this country to build capabilities that we can put into the hands of our warfighters. Our business model is build, deploy, iterate, and then sell to the CAF, all on our balance sheet. That's so we can expedite that process.